Since 1972, video game consoles have been redefining what home entertainment could be. Although at times more of a vision than a tangible product, with each new generation of consoles bringing progressively more powerful hardware. With transistors increasing pretty much in line with Moore's law, the obvious perceivable difference to everyday consumers comes in the form of bigger, more complex, and infinitely better looking games. Every generation has those games that really push the latest killer consoles to their limits, draining every last ounce of performance from these machines, but with the ever-shifting boundaries of what exactly dictates cutting edge. Sometimes it's nostalgia and not genuine quality that defines the legacy of a game. The aim of this series is to take a critical look at these games we automatically accept to be console and possibly genre defining, and asking the question, with as little bias as possible, how good was it? On the chopping block today is the debut of Yuji Naka's speedy blue mascot, Sonic the Hedgehog. Released in all regions by July of 1991, Sega marketed Sonic with surgical precision, while leaking just enough information to pique public interest. They held their cards very close to their chests, dubbing him Mario Killer. In a previous video, Rise and Fall and Underhog Story, I went in depth about the history of Sonic and the journey of his character development. So, at the risk of being redundant, I won't go into the history of the character in this retrospective, as this is more about the game. If you want to watch that, I'll put an end card up at the conclusion of this video and put a link in the description. Taking a brief browse at the magazines of the time.
Oh my God! What's wrong with your face? What's wrong with your face?
You can see in real time just how Sega wanted to enter their new mascot into the 16-bit console wars. In fact, without their meticulous insertion of the blue blur, there may never have been a 16-bit console war, leading to a very different, alternate gaming landscape. Using Electronic Gaming Monthly as a non-partisan example, we see from issue 13 in August of 1990 little snippets of information being mentioned in the magazine, with readers even writing in requesting more information. This continued until issue 22 in May, when Sonic was blazoned upon the cover. EGM published a full preview hyping up their new platformer, with Sega using this issue to sneak a cheeky 8 half-page advertisement spliced either side of the NES's new sports ball game, Bo Jackson Baseball, Ultimate Journey, and several Game Boy titles. This ad wasn't exclusive to this issue or even this magazine. Of course, this was alongside Sega's infamous Genesis does what Nintendo don't ad, something that was clearly rubbing Nintendo fans up the wrong way. Documented here by our salty friend Marty Chamberlain from Mississippi.
Over the past few months, Sega has been running an ad which says the Genesis does what Nintendo don't. It's a cute play on words, but apparently this cut on Nintendo has rubbed a few loyal NES users. To combat this, one reader, Marty Chamberlain of Magnolia MS, says this comeback to Sega, the Super Famicom is what Genesis isn't.
What a chad. Stay classy, Marty. It's obviously a small sample size of Sega's marketing, but it speaks to how they wanted to introduce what they saw as their answer for taking down Nintendo's Red Plumber. So, why am I going so in depth with the media from the time? Because with this one, context is most definitely needed. Problem is, Sonic the Hedgehog has been covered to death, and in the lexicon of modern day gamers, probably the most used phrase in regards to Sonic is overrated, which in turn is an opinion in danger of becoming a parody of itself. For me, it's hard to take modern gamers downplaying the significance of this game without a wee bit of grimace, because
I was there, man.
No amount of research a 20-something-year-old can do will ever measure up to the experience of playing a game back in 1991. This is not hyperbole. You need look no further than IGN's Game Scoop.
Sonic 1 is a non-issue. It's a terrible game. And you get about halfway through that game and then you realize it's actually very cumbersome and tedious and it's not very well laid out.
It's trial and error.
It's very trial and error.
Yeah.
And then you just kind of like, you put up with it when you're a child because you don't think of, you don't really know there's a whole nother world out there.
I don't really understand why, but there is a segment of the gaming community that really, really loves Sonic.
Sonic was never good. If you disagree, you can call the cops.
Look, shut up, you dickhead, now fuck off!
I know this interview has been memed to hell and back. Nevertheless, these are professional journalists telling you that a game that changed the landscape of the industry was never good. And this is not an isolated opinion. It's something you can find regularly pontificated on the internet. And I get it. Throw outrage and negativity is far better for the algorithm than staying the company line, and everyone is entitled to their opinions. But the case I put forward is this. Sega challenging Nintendo's dominance was equally as important as Nintendo's own efforts pulling the gaming industry from the jaws of defeat in 1985. Without Sonic, I heavily doubt that Sega would have been a serious threat to Nintendo's crown, especially in North America, leading the Big N to continue their predatory practices and displays of anti-competition. At the time, it was a defining moment, not only for Sega but for the industry in general. Going back to the 30-year-old magazines, the reviews support the exact experience we had when the game was released. Reading through the articles, you won't see a reviewer moaning about the loss of speed in Marble Zone. You'll see them celebrating the diversity of gameplay. You won't see them berating the now divisive Labyrinth Zone, instead commenting on the breath mechanic. And finally, you won't see them labelling the game as overrated, instead opining all the hype was well justified. It's worth taking mainstream pre and reviews with a pinch of salt though. And remember, the access media outlets are incentivised to give positive reviews, regardless of how non-partisan they claim to be. Retrospect is a double-edged sword. While it allows us to learn from past mistakes, it also lends a tendency from looking back from a less favourable viewpoint, especially if the person doing the retrospection has no nostalgia towards the media. The point of all this preamble isn't to change your personal opinion on the matter, but more to give you context on how I feel about the game. Wait, I've got something for this.
Sonic was never good. If you disagree, you can call the cops.
Also,
Oh boy, here I go killing again.
Am I biased? Well, I'll let this speak for itself. Seriously though, I'm going into this playthrough with eyes wide open. I haven't played the original Sonic all the way through in 15 years. In between the time of having an undying love for the game, and now, I have heard all the recent negative opinions you have. So, my approach in this review is to tame my own biases, while not dismissing genuine criticism. But let's be honest, there really is no such thing as an objective opinion when it comes to retro games we love. As for the playthrough, this one is pretty straightforward. I'm playing the game on an RGB modified Japanese Model 1 Mega Drive, line doubled with an OSSC, captured and rendered in glorious 4K with an Alva Media 4K Live Gamer and an RTX 4090. As always, no emulation was used unless stated. I'm sure everyone is aware, but for those who aren't, the PAL version of this game, including the one I played as a kid, runs at 50Hz, making the gameplay and music slower. Personally, I much prefer the 60Hz iteration. It feels more like how the game was intended to be played. So, we're going with the NTSC version of the game for this retrospective. I would also like to take a moment to talk about the RGB output of the Mega Drive and Genesis. If you still play your console, you simply must get an RGB triple bypass installed. I offer this comparison for your consideration. Both these captures were from the same console, pre- and post-install. The Mega Drive really is capable of a stunning picture. So, with the scene being set and my prelude rant over, let's spin jump into the 16-bit world of Sonic the Hedgehog. Sega! 3 seconds in and I already have thoughts. This Sega intro was massive at the time. It would go on to establish Sega as a brand. A silly little detail, but games on the Mega Drive would constantly play around with this logo, giving Sega a playful image. The jingle consists of 2 chords, E flat and C major. Do the thing. That's what a fortune in piano lessons buys you.
No, it isn't. This is.
Reading interviews from the development team, I don't believe they knew how beloved this title screen would be. In fact, it was apparently added because they had space left over on the 4MB cartridge after ditching the sound test, depicting Sonic and his band. The 3-second sample was reportedly 1/8 of the size of the entire cartridge. The title screen boots and we get a feeling for the high energy and attitude this game is going to give us. It gives me instant flashbacks to finding out about the level select code, a combination burnt into my brain. More so than even the Konami code. While researching this episode, I found this magazine which hit me like a nostalgic brick wall. It's the exact issue I owned when I found out about the level select and debug mode codes. Quick story, back in the infancy days of gaming, there was no internet. So magazines were a primary means of getting cheat codes and guides. I went on end of term school holiday and left the magazine in my drawer. So what was an 8-year-old me expected to do but to allegedly break into the school to retrieve those valuable cheat codes? By break in, I mean walk through an unlocked door. Remember, breaking and entering is only a crime if you get caught. The first level boots up and the title screen zooms away, and we get our first glimpse of the fantastic Green Hill Zone. The stereo sound kicks in, and upon moving, the multi-layer parallax scrolling sets in motion. It was magnificent back in '91. At this point in time, the Super Nintendo had not yet been released in the West, so our reference points were the NES, and more so in the UK the Master System. But nothing on these systems looked like this. Altered Beast, Ghouls and Ghosts, Golden Axe, all great looking games had already been released on the Mega Drive. But for many, Sonic was their first real exposure into the new 16-bit era. Green Hill Zone is often considered the 3 acts that sold 1,000 lies. It's definitely a valid point. The marketing and public interest was certainly built upon the shoulders of Green Hill. It's the quintessential example of putting your best foot forward, and Sega knew it. It's certainly an overused trope these days, drawing a bemused groan from players when used in games. But in its original iteration, it's a level I could play over and over again, which I have, and that was always the objective. In regards to movement physics, Sonic glides and handles superbly. It's a massive talking point for the apologists of this game. I have to admit, at least on a conscious level, as a child I never took stock of the movement. I probably did subconsciously, but now retrospectively looking back, you can see why it comes up in conversations. Sonic uses momentum in a different way to what we had seen. Looking at Super Mario Bros. 3, the game used the yardstick for judging Sonic. The example Yuji Naka took most influence from. Mario's movement was very static. You press the jump button and Mario jumps straight up. When you move, Mario will walk until the D-pad is released. It's a very rigid system, whereas Sonic's movement in the game engine was far more fluid. Stand still and jump on uneven ground, and Sonic's jump direction will be calculated by the angle, position and variables of the ground he is leaping off of. Run forward and jump, and Sonic's movement will be affected by the speed, jump height and carry that into forward momentum. This is without yet mentioning the loop-de-loops in the game. Sure, They might have been a little bit gimmicky, but they perfectly showcase the abilities of the game engine, and I imagine that was their primary purpose. The engine does an excellent job of emulating Newton's law of motion, but hey, if you had the engine, you might as well show it off, right? Addressing the elephant, or hedgehog in the room, Sonic is fast, really fast. In an interview in between becoming a game developing legend and being arrested for insider trading, Yuji Naka said comparing Sonic to Mario, "Once you get good and memorise the levels, you can just hold down the B button and run through the stage. Even then, it just takes too long. With Sonic, I wanted to shorten that time if I could. My idea was that you'd progress slowly and carefully through the stages on your first playthroughs, as you learnt the enemy locations. But after you got used to it, you could really zoom straight through the levels." Objective achieved, Yuji. Act 1 is very much a teaching level, as in most if not all great games. You learn the ring mechanic straight away with 3 golden rings spinning just waiting to be grabbed. The game throws a few easy enemies at you and gives you plenty of room to build up your speed, and then hold your hand to find a secret star's hidden power-up. This tells the player 2 things. There will be secrets, so exploration will be rewarded, and stars are awesome. The developers wasted no time showing the player there was multiple ways to progress through the level. With the training wheel version of the high and the low ground, a design choice that would be sprinkled throughout this game, but would be used much more aggressively in later titles, with far more polarisation between the safe high path and the more dangerous low path, rewarding the player for dexterous, skillful play. Turning back to the speed, it's worth mentioning finishing the levels as fast as possible is the intended style of the game. When you pass the finish line, for want of a better word, you're rewarded with bonus points on a sliding scale based on the speed of your endeavours, fully instilling the intentions of Mr. Naka. And then there's the big ring. The first act is an easy affair, making it very possible, even on the first playthrough, to get to the end of Act 1 with 50 rings, materialising the big ring and transporting Sonic to a magical, migraine-inducing special stage. These colourful flashing stages have been a point of contention over recent years, with it being said some suffer from headaches while playing. I can only speak from personal experience, but the special stage, while very busy, was never a strain on my eyes. But then again, I'm not sensitive to headaches through visual stimuli. Looking at a 2001 interview with Hirokazu Yasuhara and Naoto Oshima, they explain how the subroutine for the special stages was developed before the game was even made. It's fully understandable why they used it. The smooth movement and multiple rotating backgrounds were a feat the fabled Super Nintendo couldn't even achieve, even with its legendary Mode 7, explained in that same interview by Yasuhara. As for the gameplay, I never personally enjoyed these stages. As a child, I found them unfairly hard and frustrating, something the developers used to artificially increase the replayability of the game. Video games back in the early days were rarely long affairs, so adding mechanics like this were par for the course. If a player misses one of the emeralds in a special stage, it becomes increasingly difficult to collect them all, the further into the game you get. This would lead to repeat playthroughs if you wanted to really beat the game. Look at this guy. What a fucking smug cup. It took me multiple playthroughs to collect them all for this video. It walks a very thin line between fun and frustrating, and in all honesty, it was my least favourite special stage in the series. Moving on to the second act of Green Hill Zone, and it's very much of the same. That isn't a dig, every moment of this zone is fun. It's in this act we get introduced to the last variant of the power-up TVs, the Extra Life. The new mysterious block is shown on the normal route, but inaccessible, perched upon a loop-de-loop. This is another choice the developers made to encourage exploration. Take a left. If you're lucky, you'll roll spin into the fast shoes, with the following momentum opening up the possibility of breaking the wall. Then stumble upon the low path that rewards the player with a red spring and access to that sweet extra life. It's while taking this route back in the day I first came across the infamous spike bug. I'm sure if you ask Yuji Naka, it would be one of those, it's not a bug, it's a feature situations. But it most definitely is a bug, and makes the damage mechanic inconsistent. Apart from falling down the void, all other damage is followed by a 3-second respite from further hits, making this a very frustrating discovery. Once Act 2 is over, we move on to our third and final act of our favourite zone comprised of green hills. Again, it's more of what we have already seen. That is until we reach the end level, where the screen freezes, with floating platforms either side. Cue the OG of all boss music, the thumping drums, the screeching overtones, and then the introduction of the egg-headed scientist Dr. Robotnik. He swings his giant balls, and upon learning his rather predictable attack pattern, we send him flying away to lick his wounds and fight another day. Robotnik is an interesting character. This was our first time we'd seen him, and for me, he is one of the best long-standing baddies in gaming. By now, we had Ganon, Bowser, and Dr. Wily, probably his closest comparison, but Robotnik was a different kind of evil. This was an evil doctor, motivated by world domination, the regular fare. But taking Sonic's cute, fluffy pals, transforming them into evil robotic minions, and then setting them on our spiky protagonist. That's a level of evil I cannot tolerate. This mustachioed madman is going down. We break open the stronghold of our captured animal buddies, and the curtain closes on the best iteration of Green Hill ever created. And we've been given the basic gameplay loop. Marble Zone loads up and we are in for a very different experience from the first 3 acts. The level is darker and far more oppressive, with its decaying ruins and dark sky in background, adding environmental obstacles such as lava, mechanical moving spikes and slow moving transportation blocks. Along with the new, more hostile environment, we're given a new roster of badniks. You quickly learn, you fuck around and you find out. This is a very polarising level, not the most criticised zone, but close to it. Oh, we'll get to you later. The current day narrative is certainly weighed towards the negative side of the scales, with the most common criticism being aimed towards the reduction of speed in gameplay. And this is definitely a groupthink opinion. However, as briefly mentioned in my preface, this wasn't the view of reviewers back in the day. In fact, from the 10 magazine reviews I used as part of my research for this episode, the overall opinion was totally different and quite unanimous in celebration of the diverse gameplay. I use these examples not to convince you, but because my impression and opinion of this zone is not in line with the current consensus and far better represented by those reviewers. I can't say I love the zone. Compared to the fantastic Green Hill zone, it was certainly a downgrade, but my gripes back then came far more from the steep incline in difficulty, rather than the reduced game speed. As an adult, I don't have the same issue with the more difficult platforming, leading to quite a fun time for this playthrough. I do agree with some of the criticism, however, more specifically, the more precise platforming. The game's engine's motion mechanics doesn't lend itself well to this kind of platforming. Its gameplay much more suited towards the Mario series and something I wouldn't miss in Sonic. I will concede slightly regarding the pace. There are definitely points where you find yourself waiting for a block to float, spike platform to drop, or pillar to move. But overall, I don't find it as irritating as most seem to. At this point in the game, the player has been given all the tools they need to get the job done. Marble Zone is about honing those skills and opening a second can of whoop-ass on Robotnik. In comparison, Marble Zone is far more linear than Green Hill. In the first 2 acts, there is only one route to the end of the level. It's definitely a shame they didn't carry on the multiple path freedom allowed in the first zone. However, that is rectified in the 3rd act, and far more emphasised. We are given 2 different divergent paths early on in the act, with the 2 routes being very different in length and difficulty, and whether or not you take the shortcut in this wall, all paths lead to the same outcome, the second encounter with Robotnik. The good doctor is in, and has definitely upped his game since the last meeting. If you misjudge the rhythm of his movement, you're going to struggle. But overall, Robotnik's movement is again very predictable, and as long as you avoid getting stuck under his signature floating egg, he is easily beaten. Springyard is stunning visually. Hot take time, I personally think it's the best looking level in the game. Yes, better than even Green Hill. I love the sparkling lights, the background of green bushes, city skyline silhouette and mountains. There's a lot going on. Back in the day, I always had thoughts of a nighttime bustling casino city that never sleeps. And that's what great level sets do, give you a feeling it's a real place. While looking over the prototype of this game, you can see this was far more pronounced in the earlier builds. And in my opinion, I think the earlier version of Springyard, or Sparkling Zone as it was called, was the better version. However, with all that said, that is where the positivity for this zone ends. I find Springyard a frustrating and slow experience, void of level design, imagination, and full of poor pacing. Whereas most people's gripes start at Marble Zone, mine start here. In terms of speed, Springyard Zone takes off the leash, but not really. It's a mix between the first two zones, taking the wrong lessons from both, with some very speedy set pieces, but with slower, waiting for stuff to move sections. And I'm not as forgiving for the waiting for the arbitrary object to move parts here. It's a strange mix, where the fast sections are always bookended by obstacles, and the slow sections have no purpose than to artificially extend the game's playtime and frustrating the player. I feel like when a game pulls off something like this, it's the developers telling the player to go f*** themselves. For me, there's a lot to dislike here, but nothing tops the slow-moving large blocks. They are the worst. Slowing the game down is their primary purpose, and with the wonky hitbox, the player is penalised for wanting to get going as soon as possible. When they aren't crushing you, they are entrapping you to create a nice big target for the badniks to shoot. And yes, this is entirely deliberate. While not being obstructed by the devil's blocks, you're assaulted with spinning spiked balls and enemies you'll instantly regret jumping on. Hard to avoid without previous knowledge, with the level also suffering from the linear level progression started in Marble Zone. This is the first time I felt the game's screen could have benefited from larger real estate. As I understand it, it was a decision made from system limitations rather than artistic choice. But the game definitely improves with the wider viewpoint of the widescreen modded version. It's worth mentioning it doesn't work on real hardware though, or maybe even this. Too much? Can't believe I bought a copy of Sonic Origins for this bit. I can beat a dead horse all day long, but the summarised version is I find very little to like about Springyard Zone, apart from the visuals and pleasant soundtrack. Although Sega did have a nice message for salty Nintendo fanboys like our friend Marty. You can't please everyone all the time, and one improvement the zone does make is the Robotnik boss battle. It's the first time he's a threat and isn't just a slow-moving target for the player to emasculate. The fact that Robotnik's outside of Sonic's jump until he attacks automatically makes the fight more challenging. And with reduced floor space every time he swoops down, it makes the fight much more interesting. Don't get me wrong, it's still not hard, but it's harder. I don't enjoy being a contrarian. I don't say things just to trigger nerd rage. But I have to be honest, and my honest opinion about Labyrinth Zone is it isn't that bad. Don't get me wrong, it's not what I would call good. But sometimes I feel people hear the same opinion over and over again, and they begin to adopt the same point of view. This is especially prevalent when it comes to gamers that play the game now for the first time and didn't experience Sonic when it was hot off the presses. I totally understand. It's very hard to get into a 30-year-old game for the first time and not have your opinion tainted by the most repeated narrative. But for me, it does some things wrong, but it also does some things right. You have to remember the context. When the first installment was released, there really wasn't anything like it. Sure, in the wider scope of platformers, It was a Mario clone, pure and simple, but it was the first Mario clone that brought something different to the table. Once the later games in the series came out, they massively improved upon the water levels, adding the high and low ground gameplay. Something that caused players and reviewers to look back at Labyrinth Zone from a less favourable viewpoint. But at its core, Labyrinth Zone just adds another string to Sonic's gameplay bow. It adds more overall to the experience than Spring Yard Zone, and took far more effort for the developers needing to program a whole new breath mechanic. This wasn't a filler level. It was a level the developers had to put a lot of time and effort into create. It's unavoidable. Yes, the gameplay is slower, Sonic's reaction time is devastated, and the breath timer was nightmare-inducing as a kid. But my god, it made it exciting. This is the best way to introduce tight platforming into this kind of Sonic game, slowing the forward momentum right down, making the player think about their movement. I always liked the idea of being in a sprawling labyrinth, exploring the depth, and monitoring Sonic's breath. I'm not saying it's perfect, there are some dick moves from the developers of the highest caliber, and some very frustrating sections, but contrasted with the overwhelming negative reception, Labyrinth Zone is a decent addition and can really test a player's skill. Upon reaching the end of the third act, you come up against the first battle with Robotnik, where the objective isn't to beat him. Let me tell you, back in the day, I cannot count how many playthroughs ended at this boss. Not being the most intelligent kid, I could never get my head around the fact that concentrating on steady platforming and not speed is what was required. One misstep sends you back down the chasm, and if you don't have it memorised, you can be in for a tricky battle. It's perfect for Labyrinth Zone, and it's another example of adding different strokes to keep the gameplay interesting. I do always wonder if the players that hate this zone, along with Marble Zone, ever wonder what the game would be like if they got what they think they want. If Sonic the Hedgehog was just level after level of re-skinned Green Hill revisions, giving those players the speed they always say they're missing, wouldn't you get bored? I think I would. I love Starlight Zone. It's as simple as that. It's not the level with the best gameplay, but goddamn the music. It's just the best. I used to pick this level from the stage select screen over and over because I love the music. Yeah, I was a weird kid. The visuals, in my opinion, are also great. The set gives me the impression of an abandoned city in a distant, dystopian future. The starry sky mixed with a great audio. It's a tranquil zone. In terms of level design, all 3 acts are a return to form, probably only exceeded by Green Hill. There are fantastic open areas, prime real estate for speed, and also some good platforming sections. This isn't the kind of tight platforming I previously criticised. It's far more forgiving and feels like what they were trying to do with Spring Yard Zone, without all the constant dead stops and... Ooh. The serious time sink sections are totally gone. There are these seesaws requiring you to wait for a spiked ball to loop over your head to launch Sonic into the air. But when you realise the more heights you get on the balls, the higher you jump, giving you access to new areas and sometimes goodies. Waiting becomes less of a chore. Speaking of different routes, Starlight Zone is also the first time in a Sonic game we see the massively opposing high and low paths. They did use it in Green Hill, but it was a much tamer version. There was very little punishment for failing to stay on the high path, and too little reward for sticking the landing. Team Sonic must have realised what a great level mechanic it was when executed properly, because they used it far more frequently in Sonic 2, and perfected it in the third instalment. The zone is far easier if you're able to stick to the higher route, and that isn't difficult to do. It's not a perfect zone though. It still suffers from the cheap instant death pits, totally counterintuitive to speedy gameplay. Also, all 3 acts are short, and a little too easy for this far in the game. It could be argued it's a respite level, before the onslaught. But even so, I would prefer they were longer. This was very apparent in the second act, possibly the shortest level in the game, depending on how you play it. There is also a small roster of badniks, consisting only of orbonauts and bombs, both very irritating enemies. I'm not a fan of enemies you cannot kill without invincibility, and both of these guys fall into that category. We speed through the first 3 acts, and then we're treated to my favourite Robotnik fight in the game. It can't be easy to think up new ways to fight Robotnik, but this is the best version of the Doctor. We are given 2 options for hitting Robotnik, either with precise timing launching the spiky ball back at him, or the more forgiving route of using the balls to shoot Sonic up into the air. There is a lot going on in this fight, and if you don't stay alert to the exploding balls, you could easily take damage. After the mandatory 8 hits, Robotnik once again escapes.
You can't keep getting away with it!
Leaving Sonic to continue the chase. I know what you're thinking. Dear God, Ranker, why don't you and Sonic the Hedgehog just get a room? Well, hypothetical straw man, as positive as I've been so far, that is about to come to an end, as there is very little to love about the final zones. Now, Scrap Brain Zone. How do I summarise Scrap Brain? Well, I hate it. I didn't like it back in the day, and I don't like it now. Scrap Brain to me was the developers running out of ideas and using all the worst aspects from previous levels to artificially increase the difficulty. Speed? Gone. Entertaining level design? Gone. Any kind of fluid gameplay? Most definitely gone. The first 2 acts are best summarised with one word: chaotic. Yes, Scrap Brain, especially Act 1, is a chaotic mess, born from trying to hike the difficulty but misunderstanding that a plethora of obnoxiously placed badniks and hazards, unavoidable without previous playthroughs and expert level knowledge, is not a good basis for challenging the player. And of course, we see a repeat of the Devil's blocks. Not the same blocks, but the same outcome of a boring time sink. This all feels very less gliding through the level and more physically trying to drag Sonic to the finish line, just trying to hold on to one ring. This was the original intention for the ring system, which is fine, but not in close quarters, taking damage from every angle. But when this is the case, finding fun in getting hit every couple of seconds becomes akin to trying to find a hedgehog spine in a haystack. Whilst doing research, I found multiple screenshots from this game that didn't match up with the final product. This was due to reviewers getting an earlier build of the game, common knowledge now, especially with the public release of the prototype cartridge, thanks to the cutting room floor. But Scrap Brain was originally called Clockwork Zone, with a missing W due to the sprite's limits. I won't go into the prototype too much as it's something I would like to cover in the future, but these screenshots were a point of much interest for many years. We move on to the second act, and nothing improves. I give points for trying to change the environment from outside to inside, giving the zone variety. But apart from that, it really is more of the same. I would say this act is even more egregious, the constant onslaught of enemies and environmental hazards. Fun additions are these platforms that trap you with electrified orbs, the abundance of buzzsaws aided by a moving floor, and ludicrous spinning platforms. We see a return of our bomb friends I previously admonished in Starlight Zone, along with the new addition of these purple bouncing pig-like things called ballhogs, which possibly could be the most irritating badniks. You can kill them, but they leave a nice present behind. For all the fun we've had on this zone, Sonic Team are about to dial it up to 11. With a rare post-act scene, we run up to a beam wall with Robotnik looking rather pleased for himself. He jumps on the button and sends us falling back down into Labyrinth Zone. Well, it's not called Labyrinth Zone, it's still called Scrap Brain Zone, but it's a palette swap of Labyrinth. It's not something I realised at the time, but apparently this is the sewer system of Scrap Brain, which is a nice touch. Even though I don't have the amount of animosity towards Labyrinth Zone most would expect, I do find revisiting it most unnecessary. Act 3 really is a story of 2 routes. You can go the intended route, or, if you are quick, you can take a really helpful shortcut. Along the normal route, it's a little punishing. It really is the same fare as Labyrinth Zone, just much harder. The slow speed of the level is taken full advantage of by the enemies, and this really is the worst version of the water levels. However, take the shortcut and you are in for the shortest act in the game. For example, on this playthrough that I didn't rush, and even made a mistake, it took 52 seconds. Ridiculously fast time for the penultimate act of the game. As the zone title suggests, this is the final zone. The final showdown with the unstoppable up to now Dr. Robotnik. And it's going to take all your super gaming skills to take down this egg-headed mastermind. Well, not really. In all honesty, my build up to the fight is far more exciting than the actual battle. As I have mentioned, I've been thoroughly impressed with Sonic Team's ability to reimagine a mundane encounter into 6 varied battles, but Final Zone definitely comes across as an anti-climax. The final fight is a repeating 2-stage boss battle. One of these 2 pistons stomp down and attempt to squash Sonic, followed by multiple falling electrified orbs that must be avoided. Rinse and repeat. The battle is made slightly more challenging by the player having 0 rings, but considering the pistons would squash Sonic with or without rings, the only thing affected is the electrified orbs, which are easily circumvented. Pick the right piston containing Robotnik 8 times. Explosion ensues. We chase Robotnik for the final time, with the evil mastermind narrowly escaping. And then, roll credits. So, with all that being said, let's rank it. We have to look at these older games in the context of their release date. And in the context of 1991, Sonic the Hedgehog was absolutely stunning. There was nothing like it. Even if you had a dislike for this game, you can never take away its groundbreaking graphics. Probably the only point where Sonic fell off a cliff was the gameplay. Considering it was their first crack at the genre, Sonic Team did the best they could and certainly learnt from their mistakes. But as a standalone game, it can get frustrating. And even though short games were commonplace back in '91, Sonic really pushed that to the extreme. I played this game all the way through 6 times for this video, and none of the playthrough recordings were longer than an hour and a half. Partnering with Japanese superstars' dreams come true, Sega team's Masato Nakamura made a soundtrack for the ages. Considering how bad the Mega Drive sound can be, especially with the GEMS engine, it's remarkable how good the sound is. Obviously this is an objective opinion, but I don't think any game on the platform bettered Sonic's music. Other games might have been just as good, but nothing better. Just like the graphics, the game engine implemented by Sonic Team was genius for the time. All Mario clones were just that, clones. But the speed and the well-integrated motion system sets Sonic apart. If you are interested in the mechanics of this game, it's well worth reading about, as they are a work of art for the period. When considering current day playability of a game, it really comes down to the perception. There are so many opinions about Sonic, but if you go in with an open mind, Sonic can be a fun time. The biggest problem, in retrospect, is I could never suggest this game over the later installments, as they improved upon the formula in every way. I award Sonic the Hedgehog a final score of 86%, placing it just behind the legend that is Mario 64 in the category of game-changing. Sonic really is one of those games it's so hard to write an objective retrospective for. Unlike in my previous episode, Super Mario 64, Sonic is far more polarising. I tried my hardest not to allow recent public opinion to depreciate my outlook. I also had to put my extensive bias towards this game to one side. By doing this, I had quite a unique playthrough, simultaneously paying attention to the most criticised flaws and trying to define exactly what I enjoy about Sonic gave me an experience of the game I haven't had before. Using the convoluted thought exercise of being stranded on a desert island only allowed one Mega Drive Sonic game. This is not the game I would ever choose nor suggest. However, considering we are not in that ridiculous situation, and Sonic's aggregate playtime is only 2 hours, if you have never played it before or haven't powered it on for a while, there really is no good reason not to play it. With so many ways to play, block out all the preconceptions, and experience one of the most important games in the history of the industry.